Good afternoon. Welcome back to the INSAs, the new IC, Empowering Women and Engaging Men for the Ignite rounds. I'd now like to introduce INSA Vice President for Policy, Larry Hanauer.
Good afternoon. Welcome to day 3 of INSA's new IC week-long series of programs. Today we mix things up a little by switching from our traditional panels to TED Talk style Ignite round sessions. Before we begin, I have some brief housekeeping items. We hope to make this as interactive as possible, so if you have questions, please submit them through the questions box on the right side of your screen. We're pleased to welcome members of the press to the call today, so this is a reminder that this program is on the record. Finally, I'd like to thank all our sponsors for their critical support of this program. Now, I'm pleased to introduce the chair of INSA's Intelligence Champions Council, Cameron Ward Hunt, a director in Guidehouse's National Security Practice, who will introduce our speakers today. Cameron?
Thank you, Larry. Good afternoon. As Larry mentioned, I'm chair of INSA's Intelligence Champions Council. We're proud to support today's program as building a diverse, talented, and mission-focused workforce is core to our council's mission. The ICC supports a number of events throughout the year, including speed mentoring and the annual Achievement Awards. To learn more about the council and how you can get involved, visit the INSA website. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our Ignite Round speakers. Each of our presenters has a tremendous wealth of experience, and I'm really looking forward to hearing their perspectives on the unique power of women. In the interest of time, we're going to hold questions until all three have finished, and then we'll do a Q&A round. Now to kick off the program, we have Jill Bruning, Executive Vice President and General Manager of Amentum. In this role, Jill is responsible for the organization's intelligence community business. In addition, she was my predecessor on the council, serving as chair from 2016 to 2019. Jill will kick off the program by discussing bias as biological, understanding, embracing, and leveraging our differences for success and balance. Over to you, Jill.
Thanks, Cameron. I'm Jill Bruning of Amentum. And although Amentum is a fairly new company, we are 20,000 employees strong, and we have a 100-year heritage of providing engineering and technical services through legacy companies that you may have heard of, like AECOM, URS, McNeil, SSI, and EG&G. As you can see from the bio on the side of the page, I'm a mechanical engineer, and I've been supporting government contracting business in the national security and intelligence arena for about 35 years. For the majority of my career, I did not openly talk about or even acknowledge specific references to the fact that I was female, and often the only female in my workplace. So I'm really excited to be part of this discussion, and a special thank you and shout out to INSA for your 3rd year of hosting this event. So we're going to spend the next 12 minutes thinking about our thinking. Next chart, please. So Jennifer Lawrence, the Academy Award-winning actress, wrote an op-ed a few years ago on gender pay equity. And it was the inspiration for an article in the Washington Post about how women say things in meetings. Although these translations are meant to be kind of humorous, I recognize some of these gender speech attributes, and some of these observations really hit home with me. Earlier in my career, I often prefaced my points with groveling apologies, and I wasn't really sorry about what I was about to say, but I did lack the confidence. And I also wanted to be liked, so I softened my language. When I tried to emulate men by speaking more directly, I was often perceived as saying something offensive and maybe being difficult or even angry. And so I felt like I was in this no-win situation. And what I later learned in this article also shows is that lots of women struggle with this dilemma. Doing a little research, I found on average, women use 3 times as many words as our male counterparts. That may explain why we get interrupted 3 times more. But why is that? Women have verbal centers on both sides of their brains, while males tend to have verbal centers only in the left hemisphere. Therefore, we tend to use more words in discussions or when describing things. There are actually over 100 differences between male and female brains. Next chart. So technology has facilitated the ability to actually map neural connections in our brains. And it provides us some insight into the patterns of how we think. Researchers at the University of Pennsylvania conducted a study, which is pictured here, that shows connectomes in the brains, which are maps of our neural connections. This particular study is one of the largest on male and female brains of over 1,000 young people. There's no absolutes, but there is potential for some neural basis of gender attributes. So let's take a look. The top brain with the blue lines excels in linear thinking. It's primarily thinking front to back. It likes to process discrete topics. It acts like a tunnel from information to action. It likes to complete a thought before going on to the next one. It's better at spatial processing, receiving information, and producing a response. Make a decision, move on. The bottom brain with the yellow lines has greater connectivity clearly between the right and left hemispheres. This brain is likely better at integrating analytical and sequential processes. It can quickly transition. It likes to multitask. It connects things to emotions and memories. Also tends to remunerate on decisions. So which brain is the female brain? We're going to bring up the poll, and you can click on the quick poll. Which one is the female? Is it the top brain with the blue lines or the bottom brain with the yellow lines? So just select your answer if you're on a computer today. And Jeff, we can just go ahead and close that poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so what percent had the answer? Absolutely, the bottom brain. So the bottom brain with the yellow lines is the female brain, and the one with the blue lines is the male brain. So keep in mind that these are averages of brain thinking, and it was done with young people in their teens and 20s. Our thinking evolves, and these patterns can change as we age, and our brains can adapt and learn new ways of thinking. But the point is, when we think about the best outcomes in business performance or innovation, it's when both brains work together. Businesses need diverse thinking. We need different ages, we need different races, and we need different backgrounds. But the most profound thinking difference in our brain is actually found in gender. You can obviously get groupthink when you have teams of only one gender. So the key is gender balance, and there is value and need for both. Next chart, please. Although we've made some great advances in gender balance overall, progress at the top of organizations is slow. The intelligence community has some phenomenal women leaders, and you've heard from some of them this week. However, we are still dealing primarily with a male leadership culture. And as a minority, we are trying to be included. We're trying to fit in. And when we don't fit in, most of us feel isolated or excluded or even ostracized. So think back to a time in your life when you were socially excluded or you were rejected from a peer group. Remember what that felt like. When people feel emotional pain, the brain gets activated in the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. Neuroscience tells us that the physiological pain caused by being excluded actually affects the same part of the brain as physical pain. It is painful. So what do we do about that? I don't know about you, but I try to avoid pain. And so we try to fit in, we try to blend in. And so we bend or we change our behaviors to try to adapt to the culture. And then when we aren't our authentic selves in the workplace, that can create stress or being uncomfortable or unhappy. When we think leader and think male, that's a mindset that creates barriers for women, and it tends to keep us on the outside. Another double bind is when a woman takes charge. We tend to be viewed as competent, but disliked. And when we take care, we're liked, but viewed as less competent. It's still true when a little boy asserts himself, he's called a leader. And when a little girl does the same, she kind of risks being branded as bossy. I was that bossy little girl. And it was a negative connotation, and it kind of sent a message to me that it was wrong to speak up. Some great work is actually being done on this through Sheryl Sandberg's #BanBossy campaign. So the goal is to be authentic. Examine where you might be bending to try to fit in. And to our leaders, whether you're male or female, be aware of the cultures you're creating so you can listen and drive acceptance. Okay, so in addition to all these patterns of how we think, we have the additional complexity in our brains of the sheer amount of information that's coming in. According to an MIT study, about 11 million pieces of information enter our brains at any one time, but we can only absorb maybe 50 of those. So we both unconsciously and consciously filter information through our frontal cortex. So I'd like to do a very short little exercise. So if you could pick up a pen and paper, if you have it next to you, and write down for me your 5 favorite letters. So don't overthink it too much. Just your 5 favorite letters. Just write them down. There's 26 letters in the English alphabet. Just pick 5 of them and write them down on the page. Okay, is everybody done? We're going to open up the polling feature now. So look at your 5 letters that you wrote down and answer yes or no to this question. Is one of the 5 favorite letters the first letter of your first name or the first letter of your last name? Just click yes or no. Is one of the 5 letters first letter of first name or first letter of your last name? Okay, Jeff, we can go ahead and close that poll. All right, let's see the results. All right, you are typical of most audience. 90% of us answered yes to that question. And why is that? Well, we tend to favor what is familiar. You say and write your name a lot. Generally, we think without thinking. That's the biological way our brains work. If you have a brain, you have bias. Some of our bias is conscious. We're aware of it. It's your favorite color, your favorite shoes, favorite vacation spot. But it's the unconscious bias that plays a role in selection processes or institutional barriers that prevent people from advancing. Bringing unconscious bias to consciousness is how we can change it. We can change our minds. We can interrupt bias. So challenge yourself. Sometimes with me, I reverse the gender or reverse the race of a situation and ask myself, would I do the same thing? Would I have the same behaviors? It's not just enough to be diverse. We need to include diverse people. The goal is to create a sense of belongingness that helps people feel they're valued. Companies with a high inclusive engagement have 3 times the operating profit than those that don't. Diversity without inclusiveness doesn't work. So to all the women, a call to action. We are making progress. We need to help and support each other. We need to be visible champions to help eliminate barriers. To the men, you are the ones still in power, and so the real work is in your court. Women didn't give themselves the right to vote 100 years ago. It was the men in leadership who voted for that change. Diversity is about getting invited to the party. Inclusion is about getting asked to dance. Thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to your questions. And back over to you, Cameron.
Great, thank you, Jill. And what Jill didn't share was her favorite letters are INSA. Thanks, that was really thought-provoking. We'll have some great questions for you at the end. Just a reminder for participants on there to submit questions. You should have a questions box on the right side of your screen. We're going to hold all those to the end, and then we're going to ask them of several of our panelists. Speaking of, our next presenter is Hope Goins. She's Staff Director of the House Representative Committee on Homeland Security. She's the top advisor to Committee Chairman Benny Thompson on all matters related to oversight of the Department of Homeland Security and national security through the executive branch. Today, Hope is going to share her thoughts about effective leadership through adversity, navigating challenges in 2020 and beyond. Take it away, Hope.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Cameron, and thank you, INSA, for the invitation. I just want to talk about a few things that the committee has been working on and things that I've gone through as a leader in the United States Congress. As Cameron stated, I'm the staff director for the House Homeland Security Committee. We have oversight over DHS and also other national security agencies throughout the executive branch. So since we have been in this mode, we have been doing a lot of robust oversight over the COVID-19 pandemic. The United States just hit the 3 million mark of having confirmed cases of COVID-19. We actually had a hearing this morning with state and local officials on the pandemic. We have a very, very diverse professional staff on our committee. We have members of Black community, Hispanic, South Asian, LGBTQ community, and our staff diversity has been that way for years, especially under Chairman Thompson's leadership. I've been on the committee for 12 years, and we've always had that type of diversity on our staff, which has led us to do some great legislation, because when you have a staff that looks like America, you can bring the values from all over America to the table when it's time to make policy, to the table when it's time to speak about legislation. So having that type of staff, we've been able to do a lot of good things on domestic terrorism. This Congress, we had the first hearing on domestic terrorism in 8 years. We also were able to do some DT legislation. And also this Congress, we were able to look at how Russian interference affected Black and Brown communities and how Black and Brown voters were targeted in the 2016 elections and do policy based on that. Since COVID-19, we've taken a keen look at health disparities and the health disparities involving COVID-19. And it's just that way for us because we see each other, we see America, and also we're serving the most diverse Congress. This Congress is the most diverse Congress in United States history. And so we're able to have legislation, have policies that can affect people in rural America, suburban America, inner cities, and be able to think about Americans as a whole. And I think we've been doing better for our country is better for that right now. In addition to that, we have seen some changes. Like I said, I've been on the committee for 12 years. And I laugh because I remember when we would enter into rooms and our committee would enter into meetings with our IC partners, and our IC partners, we would be the only diversity in the room. However, there has been a lot of changes over the 12 years, and we welcome that because it helps diversity and inclusion really, really helps create better policy. Jill mentioned earlier about being included and being excluded and being told when you do not fit in. I would like to say, due to my chairman and due to my years of experience, I do feel as if I fit in. And Jill mentioned sometimes about the pain that you feel when you know or when you're told that you didn't fit in. And there have been times at the workplace where I did feel especially earlier in my career, where I did feel that I didn't fit in. But I do recall one of the first times that I was told that I didn't fit in. And it happened when I was 6. When I was 6, birthday parties were a huge deal to elementary school students. I'm sure many of you all are parents, you know that birthday parties are a huge deal. And a girl came to school. She gave all the girls in the classroom an invitation to her party. And all the girls were happy to receive them. And then the next day came and the girl had to come back, get a group of girls together, a select group of girls with the girl that had given the invitation along with the teacher. We had to have a short little meeting. Well, at 6, it was just, let's come and talk right quick. And a group of us were told we were no longer invited to the party. And the group of us had one thing in common, and that was that we were all Black. And that year and that one particular birthday party changed the trajectory of birthday parties for our class throughout the entire year and also throughout probably the duration of our elementary school. I remember the confusion that I had at the time and that some of the other girls had at the time. So knowing that being excluded and being told that you don't fit in or being made to feel that way, I try to make sure that in the workplace, everyone on the staff is included and everyone in the staff has to feel seen. And I will say that we have those conversations regularly. And I would say one of the most difficult periods this Congress and one of the most difficult periods throughout this pandemic and throughout the time we've been socially distant, because we have a very, very close staff, people that when people that socialize in and outside of work. But I would say during this time of being socially distant, there was one time where I really, really wish that we could have gathered. And that was in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and in the wake of the protest, because there was just so much unrest and a reckoning in this country. And it really, really made me think about how I do empower the women on my staff and engage the men. And the number of Black males that I had on my staff and the number of people of color that are on our staff, and I could not ignore the conversation. And leading a majority minority staff, the racial reconciliation conversation was quite different, because these are the staffers that represent the best. And plus, we have conversations about race regularly because we have to have them throughout our oversight work, throughout our legislative work, because when we think of legislation, when we try to legislate or when we sit down with policymakers, we're always including others. We're always including thoughts of, well, how would this affect the Black community? How would this affect the Hispanic community? How would this affect women? And so our racial reconciliation conversation was just very different. And I would also say that even now, at a time where everything is politicized or questioned, we have to really see how we're going to use our power. Are we going to use our power because we have it? We've seen it today. Jill spoke about it. I've spoke about it. And actually the women that you had yesterday on the mentoring panel spoke about it. We have the power to include and we have the power to exclude. And in order for us to advance in humanity, I know we have to use the power to include. We have the power to create fear. We also have the power to create advancement. And my belief is that we should use our power to create advancement. So I ask you all, as we think about the new IC, how are you going to engage your power? How are you going to use your power? And thank you so much. And back to you, Cameron.
Thank you, Hope. That was terrific. And thank you so much for sharing that perspective. Our final presenter, Natalie Zylstra, serves as the Director of the Office of Data Strategy and Compliance in the National Counterterrorism Center. In this role, Natalie oversees data science, compliance and transparency, and data acquisition and policy for the NCTC. Today, she's going to discuss the importance of sponsorship and offer advice on personal branding. Thanks, Natalie.
Great, thank you. I'm happy to be here and pretty humbled to be asked. As Cameron mentioned, I'm going to speak a little bit about sponsorship and personal branding today. I'm also hopeful that folks had a chance to dial into the mentoring conversation yesterday. I found it fascinating. What I do want to highlight is that I'm not talking about mentorship, but it is a similar concept, right? So sponsorship. So with that, next slide, thank you. So I love this definition. I pulled this definition from Forbes magazine. They did a pretty good study on women in the technical field and talked really about sponsorship and kind of what women sometimes overlook. So another way to describe sponsorship is the way Sylvia Ann Hewlett does it in her book, Forget a Mentor, Find a Sponsor. She talks about basically that mentors give and that sponsors are invest. You definitely need both, but the sponsors will advance your career more. The difference is mentorships, like we talked about yesterday, really are just a good thing to do, something that just feels right and that mentees get value out of. Sponsorship is a little bit different. It is a transactional relationship, so the sponsor and the person they are sponsoring should both really benefit from the conversation. Women in particular tend to downplay this need. Women tend to believe that just by doing good work and working hard will get them ahead, and that's just not reality, right? The reality is you have to figure out a way to help yourself advance. And I think the second quote kind of highlights that the best. A little lengthy, but the gist of it is that you're not always going to be in the room. So when you're not in the room, you need that sponsor to be able to advocate for you and to mention your name for the positions that are coming up or for the opportunities out there. Sponsors, they do a lot of things. They help you take risk by providing top cover. They help you identify some stretch opportunities. And a lot of it is them providing connections, right? So them, again, being in the room and advertising you for positions as things are being created and things are coming up. What you do for a sponsor is you begin to become kind of that loyal brand of outstanding performers, right? Those folks that they can continue to work with throughout your career. You provide the legacy and just sort of that larger network for them as well. So with that, next slide. So I think the stat says it great. So the stat is from McKinsey Institute. They did a pretty good look at women in the financial services. And as you can see, over half the senior women understand and sort of agree that sponsorship helps move them ahead, but only a third of entry-level women thought it was important, right? So there's clearly a disconnect there. I will say there is not a lot of data out there on women in the US government or women in IC in particular. So when I tend to look at how we should sort of evaluate and advance the IC, I do tend to focus on financial and technical services. Just my observation, they tend to have the same diversity challenges we do across our organizations. I think folks don't recognize the value of sponsorship because they tend to think of it as a shady practice. And it was, right? So historically, it was powerful men lifting up younger men that looked and spoke like they did. Things, you hear like the good old boys network or cronyism. Sponsorship was affinity based. So again, just that look and feel like you do. That is absolutely not what I'm talking about today. As we've, you heard from Hope and from Jill, it is that value diversity that we need, right? So I am talking about sponsorship based on your value to the organization and kind of what your unique skills are. So with that, I want you to think about, who's your sponsor, right? Who is advocating for you when you're not in the room? And I want you to also think about, depending on where you are in your career, who are you helping bring up at the junior ranks, right? Who are you sort of nominating to take that next step? So to sort of get to that, I imagine your next question is, if you don't already have a sponsor, is how do you identify a sponsor and how do you kind of build that connection, right? And with that, I want to talk a little bit about personal branding and the innate value you sort of add. So lengthy quote, and I will be honest, I don't actually like the phrase personal branding, but I just don't have a better one. But the gist of it is personal branding is what makes you you. It's your uniqueness. Your value, what makes you stand out among your peers, right? So you have colleagues, you're all good workers. What do you offer that's a little bit different or a little bit extra, right? Whether that's an additional skill, whether that's a different background you have, what is your innate sort of value to the organization that helps you stand out? And you may not know what that is. So if you don't know what that is, this is where I think you need to leverage your mentors and leverage your peers and your supervisors and ask those questions. Ask those questions like, what is helping me stand out? What am I doing right? What do I excel at, right? What differentiates me from others? I will say when you ask for the compliments, you also need to ask for the negative feedback. Women in particular have a hard time getting that unvarnished feedback and they desperately need it. There is a tendency to sort of sugarcoat feedback when you're talking to women, and it's just not at all helpful. So speaking personally, I spent my first 10 of my 17 years in the IC hearing that I was doing a good job and to just keep it up. Not at all helpful, actually at all. So it wasn't until I was about 10 years in that I started to get some honest feedback. I started to meet some folks who would turn out to mentor me, started to make some connections with some senior leaders and get those sponsors and just really sort of change things around. but it was because I started to get that unvarnished feedback. So if you're not getting it right now, you need to absolutely just demand it. You have to get it. And when you are thinking about that and thinking about, okay, the good things that you're doing, the things that make you stand out, think about how you would present that. And that's where I'm going to use the phrase, the elevator pitch. And I feel like there are eye rolls in the audience because we talked about an elevator pitch for the last 10 years and pretty much all the training I've ever taken. And it is the idea that if you're stuck in an elevator with a senior and you only have 2 minutes to explain your worth and your worth to the organization, kind of what you do, that you need to have that speech prepared. And the truth is we've heard about it for the last decade because it is that critical. Those opportunities are rare, and you need to just understand your innate value and be able to sort of brand it and sell it and just take advantage of those opportunities because again, they are rare. So probably wondering then, how do I tie personal branding and how do I figure out who should be my sponsor? And so with that, I want to kind of highlight the fact that the sponsor should be different than you. Again, we don't want that affinity based. We don't want that good old boys network. So for me personally, when I look for a sponsor, I think about sort of my innate value, right? So for me, I am a process person. I can organize things, I can create steps, I can make sure things get done, and that is just kind of who I am. What I'm not is an extrovert. I am not a people person at all, right? So, the reason I'm speaking today, honestly, is I'm only looking at myself on the camera, and there's some benefit in that. So when I look for a sponsor, I look for those folks who are that extrovert, right? That have that instant rapport with others, that can make others feel instantly comfortable. So the value that they bring to me in my career is they help sort of bring more folks in and get folks more engaged. The value I bring to them and to the organization is that I can help sort of lay out the next steps and figure out how we, better organization or whatever we're kind of working on. And that's what I tend to go for. Your skills, of course, should be different. And then, of course, when I look to sponsor people, I am also looking for the exact opposite, right? So I am not looking for another person that looks like I do, that talks like I do, that has the same skills. I am looking for somebody that is not like me to, again, just help that diversity in the senior ranks and help kind of moving up where they need to be. So we talked about personal branding, we've talked about sponsorship and how you have to have the elevator pitch, and you're supposed to do all this while you're protecting national security, while you're being a mom or a sister or a friend. And with that, I kind of want to transition a little bit to talk about self-care. I think the airline attendant analogy is the best when it talks about you have to put your oxygen mask on others before you help yourself, and that's absolutely true. So if you are so burnt out that you can't help yourself, you can't help others either. So here's my stat. I actually love this stat. Stanford study back in 2015 did a pretty good look at how many hours you should work in a work week and basically how effective they are. I will say back in 2015, my kids were pretty young. They were 5 and 8, and I was looking for any sort of justification to get me out of the office more, to get me home at a decent time so I could play with my boys. And this did it for me. So this sort of highlighted to me the fact that working myself to death was not only not going to help me get ahead, it was also just not even beneficial to the organization and certainly not to myself or my family. So here I am 5 years later, still quoting this study, and I still believe it's true. I think it's particularly important to highlight right now because a lot of folks are on a sort of week on, week off or some other shift schedule. What I am noticing around my workplace is when people are on their week on, they are somehow thinking they are going to do 2 weeks worth of work in 1 week. It's not true. It's not going to happen. And I'm watching them exhausted and burning themselves out. And while I can send my folks home, I can't do that to the larger organization. And so I just kind of want everyone to sort of keep the stat in their head that working 70 hours is no more productive than working 50 hours or 55 hours. So no reason to stay an extra 15, 20 hours at work. You should just enjoy your home life as well. So with that next slide. All right, so COVID, right? So obviously it's just a not great time in our country. So I wanted to throw this up here just because I think it's so much more critical now to focus on self-care. So speaking personally, I see people that are exhausted all over the place. I look at myself in the mirror on occasion and just there's exhaustion around. So for me, I'm raising a teen and a tween, and so I have become the entertainer and become the teacher at a time when I had to take away all their sports, and I told them they couldn't see their friends. And also I lost all my outlets, right? So I wasn't able to go have coffee or wine with a friend. I wasn't able to go on a date night with my husband. And I wasn't even able to go to the gym up until a couple weeks ago, right? So more so now than ever, I think it's important to sort of do that self-care and prioritize that me time. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to really highlight that right now with everything going on with COVID. So with that, I'll transition to my last slide. All right, wanted to end on a positive note. So Jill mentioned it as well, but 100 years since the 19th Amendment was ratified. So 100 years that women have gotten the right to vote. And I know 2020 is a rocky year and not a great year, but I want to make sure that all of us recognize this sort of huge occasion in our country's history. Hope mentioned it as well, but I've also noticed changes in the last decade or so in the IC. So when I started in the early 2000s, there were women leaders, but they were a token. There was one director, one deputy, like one woman at the table, one woman in the room, and that is not at all what I see today. So still not quite equal, but definitely getting there. There are several directors and deputies, female, that I engage with. At NCTC, we have our first deputy director is a female for the first time in our history, and these are just huge things that are worth celebrating, as well as, you know, obviously our 100-year celebration with the 19th Amendment. And I just don't want to go by without just sort of recognizing all the progress that we've made, acknowledging we still have a lot more to go. And with that, I will turn it back over to Cameron. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Natalie. We're going to bring back all of our speakers for a question and answer round. I've got lots of good questions coming in. To start off with, though, as we get all of the presenters back on camera there, I'll start out with one for everybody to answer in turn, and we'll start with Jill. But you each presented some really interesting perspectives, diverse topics, everything from neuroscience to diversity and inclusion to sponsorship and mentorship. It was really great. So what I'm really interested in is, what are you listening to, reading, or watching that's influencing your thinking right now that you would be willing to share with folks? And Jill, we'll start with you.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to fess up. I'm reading White Fragility. And certainly, I think all of us just need to understand racism more. And so for me, that's been fascinating and very eye-opening. So that's what I'm reading.
All right, Hope. You might be muted. Okay, I don't hear. Let me move to Natalie, and we'll come back and get Hope's response to that once we get our audio. There you go. Are you there?
Well, I'll hop in and answer first. So while I'd love to say I am reading great life-changing books, that is just not reality. Reality is I want to decompress and ignore the news for a bit when I get home. So I'm reading a whole bunch of books that I probably won't admit to on here. But the one book I did mention during my speech that I do think was really eye-opening was Sylvia Ann Hewlett's book, Forget a Mentor, Find a Sponsor. And I think that really just describes just sort of what we need to do to kind of you know, figure things out and move ahead. So.
Okay, Hope.
Hi, can you hear me now?
I can, yes, thank you.
Okay, great. I have not necessarily been reading any books. What I have been doing is having conversations and sharing stories and hearing people from also the private sector and other areas throughout the house, other offices. I've had many coffees with people to discuss what is going on and changes in the workplace. So I think I've been having more one-on-one conversations and one-on-one stories. And I think those have been a little bit more helpful to hear from people that I know and people that I'm getting to know, so we can navigate these challenges in the workplace.
All right, great, thank you. Let me move on to some questions from the audience, and they're terrific. And I'm going to start with, this is a tough one for Jill, but I'll ask you this one. So one of the questions was, how can I work with or around a male coworker in a leadership role who minimizes my contribution and leadership, suggesting that I don't need guidance when I don't, and hinting that others are responsible for my accomplishments? Jill, what advice would you give?
Well, first of all, you're not alone. And I think that's where support of other women really helps. There's no single answer to how to handle every situation, but having people to talk to, and especially other women who've been there, and those of us who are older, who've been in the industry for a long time, we've all had those kind of situations and handled them well and handled them poorly. And so it's up to us to kind of help others navigate those. And, there are some, cultural aspects that are still male dominated, but there are also a lot of men out there who are also champions and sponsors. And so helping find not only a support group of women, but also men that can help advocate and sponsor for you, I think in those situations really does help.
All right, great. Yeah, it's helpful to remember you're not alone out there. Thank you. This one's for Hope. We've got lots of good ones. I'm going to narrow in on one, and then we'll come back to a broader one. And this is from Dieta Kitchens. You mentioned that the diversity composition of the IC agencies does not look as diverse as the congressional committees. What expectations does this Congress have of the intelligence community to improve hiring, retention, development, and promotion of a diverse talent pool within their agencies?
Well, I think one thing that this Congress does is that, number one, the intelligence community is required by law to show their diversity number to Congress, so Congress can hold them accountable. But on top of that, I would say Chairman Thompson especially has been very, very collaborative, and also Congresswoman Sewell, Congressman Carson, Congressman Schiff. They've all been very, very collaborative with the intelligence community. So by doing that, encourage members of the IC to attend job fairs in their district, to attend job fairs at historically Black colleges and universities throughout the United States, and attend job fairs at minority serving institutions. And by having that type of collaboration and that type of working with Congress and members of Congress that are not just from DC, members of Congress that have reaches in other areas to actually bring people from their districts and get people from their districts to know the IC. I think that is how Congress holds the IC accountable, and the IC has done very, very well with working with members on that. And we have had conversations with DNIs in the past, also with the leadership at DHS INA, to make sure that we're on the track to diversify. And that even goes on with the IC as far as the executive branch goes, but we also have those conversations with partners in the private sector. Many corporations, we have suggested and actually brought them to members' districts, to areas outside of Washington or to areas outside of metropolis, to ensure that students and future generations get exposed to these types of careers.
All right, thank you. Natalie, let me throw a question to you. I've got several good ones for you, but I'm going to start with this one. So this is from Julie Dyer. I've a senior mentor that I think would be a good sponsor and may have well been acting in that capacity already. How do I approach her to make that sponsorship relationship a little bit more confirmed like you described?
So great question. I don't know that I would call it is sort of like defined as that, right? So just more having a conversation about, what else can I do? Are there other opportunities that you see for me? And just sort of asking those questions and asking for that senior sponsor to keep their eye open for you for your next position and to just speak to you in different meetings. I don't know that you necessarily have to call it a sponsor or not call it a sponsorship. But just sort of continuing that dialogue. And then at the same time, when you're asking for something, also always offer help, right? So is there something I can do for you? Is there something additional that I can help you with, right? And so recognizing that regardless of where you are in an organization, you need help on something, right? So just make sure when you're asking for help, you're also offering it as well.
Okay, great. Okay. I'm going to ask this for all three of you here, and this is from Stuart Wineland, and I think it's very timely. There's been a lot of increased discussion about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion lately, and so I want to get your thoughts here. What steps can both government agencies and companies take to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workforce? And if possible, what are your organizations doing that provides an example? And Jill, we'll start with you.
Okay, so that's a big question and a big topic, but a lot of focus right now on unconscious bias and the culture. You know, we chip away at things a little bit at a time, and as a lot of people have said, it's you can measure diversity, but if you're not an inclusive culture, you're actually can do harm by excluding people. And so it's about inclusion, it's about the culture acknowledgement, and it's about training so that we can become aware of biases and then to work together to eliminate them. Only by speaking up, we all have that responsibility, both individually and as part of institutions, to make those changes. As Hope was saying, one birthday party at a time.
Okay, Hope?
Thank you, Jill. And I would agree with what Jill said. And I realize that I lead a majority minority staff, but that is not the way it is in the House of Representatives, and it's not the way it is in most of America. And what I would say is at the House, we have instituted unconscious bias training. But in addition to that, when we look at diversity and inclusion, we can't continue to look at it in the same lens without thinking about recruitment. And where are we recruiting? And how are we packaging the jobs? How are we packaging and marketing this sector to colleges? How are we marketing this sector to students in high school so they will think that they can be a part of it? And it's going to take sending more than the only Black person or the only Hispanic person or the only woman that you have to one college in the backyard. You're going to have to take this type of recruitment on the road and throughout America so you can create a pipeline. If you create a pipeline, you're breaking down some of the barriers right there. And then once people enter the pipeline, the mentorship, the sponsorship, the ability to create an environment where you are welcome to speak up and you're welcome to point out what's wrong without being endangered of being excluded. I think that's something that we all have to remember that we need to foster.
Great, thanks. Natalie?
Yeah, so we at OD9 at NCDC, we have, they're called employee resource groups, and it's basically groups focused on the underrepresented populations and kind of having those conversations and figuring out how we go forward. And just to highlight, it is not groups made up solely of the underrepresented population. It involves sort of the larger workforce, right? Hope mentioned unconscious bias training. We do require unconscious bias training for everybody who is in a management role, for everybody who sits on any sort of hiring panel or bonus panel or promotion panel. Just again, you have to recognize it to be able to combat it and to be able to figure out how to move forward. And so that's something we require. I will say recently, one of the very junior members of my workforce with the Black Lives Matter asked how to have that conversation at work and how do we sort of structure that and work through that. Honestly, I am beyond thrilled that she brought up wanting to have the conversation at work. I think that's just a huge sign of good progress in our country. And so we're kind of figuring out how to do that in a structured way. But it's just sort of encouraging questions like that, encouraging folks to talk about the hard subjects and figuring out the way to really sort of address it and move it forward.
Okay, great. Natalie, I'll stay with you, and this is not an easy one again, so here's the question. My managers told me that I'm not allowed to use the words I, me, and my when describing my work in presentations. I'm supposed to give credit to the team even though it's solely my work. How does one get recognized by upper management and others when their immediate manager is suppressing their contributions and taking away my ability to self-promote and give an implied credit to others?
That is a hard one. So I think it depends on how you can do it, right? So for instance, at our agency, what we have with our promotion process is an opt-in process. And so with that opt-in process, you are in control of writing your promotion packet And in those, I absolutely encourage people to use the I did this, or if you did it with team, I along with my team did the support. So I think there are things that you have control over, the same with your sort of self-evaluations and performance reviews. Your supervisor cannot sort of squash that, right? As for combating it a little bit more, I think that's about the only way to really do it, right? Because you don't want to, you can't quite go ahead and sort of refuse to credit the team, but just make sure when you do things like you prepare your elevator speech, when you write your promotion packet, that you really sort of focus on your value to kind of moving it forward, and just sort of control the things you can control. Jill mentioned leaning on other senior women, and I think one of the great things I've seen women do, or just women in general, peers and whatnot do, is that the idea of echoing. So when if Hope had a great comment in a meeting, it would be, me sort of then at another part of the table saying, Hope, that was a great comment in the meeting, sort of doing that echoing. And that is a way to make sure that the credit's recognized, and you can have those conversations with your peers and offer to do that role for them, and then them do it for you as well. That is just a couple ideas on how to combat it, but it is very tricky.
Great. Related to that, and I'll go to Jill for this, and this is a question from Ann Matthew. Do you have any advice on how more senior women in the workplace can help uplift and mentor women who are just starting out?
Well, maybe it's a sign of getting older, but it certainly is a responsibility, I think, that senior women have, because we've learned through working those barriers, and so I feel obligated to help make it easier and to partner with young people. And there's multiple forums to do that. Cameron, you know this because you're the head of the ICC. We have a speed mentoring event, which is fabulous, that INSA gives you an opportunity to meet with senior women leaders and male leaders as well, for the speed mentoring. Take advantage of every opportunity to help get that support that you need. It's out there, and we want to help.
Great. Okay, Hope, tough question for you. This is from Shane Fletcher. DHS has focused heavily on immigration and border security in the past few years. How can an agency charged with deporting and excluding people of different nationalities attract a diverse workforce? What is Congress asking DHS to do to promote diversity and inclusion?
I think that I can understand why that would be a complicated question, and why people would want to be affiliated with, would or would not want to be affiliated with such a complicated mission. I think one thing that Congress is doing is really and truly trying to get DHS, and even on our own, through the work that we do at the committee, and a lot of the work we do at the committee is bipartisan, is we let people know what DHS is and what DHS is not. I know that since 2017, DHS has been focused on being an immigration and enforcement organization, but DHS is charged with the security of this nation. DHS is also charged with cybersecurity. It also has an amazing intelligence portfolio. It's charged with securing the airports and also securing the borders, the United States Coast Guard. I think one thing is that you have to share some of the stories that are within DHS, and that's something that whenever my chairman, Chairman Thompson, speaks with Secretary Wolf, we try to make sure that we promote. And then some things we see ourselves. One story I would say is an amazing story that just came out of the Department of Homeland Security, is that they just promoted its third African-American captain in the United States Coast Guard. Her name is Captain Zeta Merchant, and she happens to be from Mississippi, just like me. But we promote that story on the congressional side. We also encourage Secretary Ruth to promote stories like that. And so, yes, it is very, very difficult when you see an agency that in the past 3 years, because it wasn't like that. It's been like that since 2017, but in the past, we've looked at it as a larger agency that lately is being used as immigration enforcement and asking people of color to join that agency. But I think you have to look at what the mission really is, and people that are in leadership at that agency. And the men and women of DHS, they have some amazing employees and amazing people that can actually share stories. And there are stories of leadership throughout DHS. I do want to say one thing and just follow up on one thing that we spoke about when we spoke about diversity and inclusion, and that is when it comes to racial reconciliation, telling stories, we also have to look at the pipeline and look at who all is in leadership. So we have to ensure that we don't have just one person putting the burden on one person to try to explain things that are going on in their community.
Yep, thank you. Okay, we're getting close to the end of our program, but I want to give each of our speakers a chance to offer their closing thoughts and any tangible advice you have for the audience or anything you'd like to wrap up with. And Hope, we'll continue with you and then we'll go to Natalie and Jill.
I think that it is very good that we are empowering women, engaging men, thinking about diversity and inclusion, and thinking about what it is to be a woman leader in the IC, what it is to be a woman leader in the private sector, and also in the United States Congress as a congressional staff member. I think we need to continue the conversation. We need to diversify the pipeline. We need to diversify who all is in leadership and continue to share those stories so we can remain inclusive. Like I stated before, we have the power to include, we have the power to create an advancement. The intelligence community has been one of the most powerful sectors in the United States for years, and we need to remain that way. And when we include and when we create the environment for advancement, we really can do that. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Natalie?
I'm going to start with just thank you for having me as well. So I have gotten a lot of, honestly, both Jill and Hope today, and as well as the mentoring conversation yesterday, and then the kickoff with Beth Sanner and Secretary James on Monday, right? And so it's just been a great forum, and I am looking to learn a lot tomorrow from my diversity panel, and just I would say just keep pushing ahead and recognize that while we have big changes to make, sometimes the little small incremental changes make the biggest difference. So just keep plugging away where you can, echoing folks around the table, trying to get more diverse groups on those panels, and just the small steps really do make a big change sometimes. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Jill?
Well, thank you for doing this again, INSA. And I think the thing we continue to learn is how important it is to have the conversations and to engage. And so I'd just like to encourage everybody, you all can do your part. And so thank you for having me.
All right, that's great. All right, Larry, over to you to thank our sponsors and wrap everything up. I think, Larry, you're still muted.
There we go. Thank you, Cameron. Thanks, Cameron, for moderating the session, and thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your stories today. Based on the Q&A and the discussion, it's obvious that people valued the insights you shared. If you relate to this afternoon's program or want to share it with a colleague, all registered attendees will get links to the session recordings next week, courtesy of our digital playback sponsor, Amendum. Looking ahead at the events, tomorrow at 2 p.m., we will hold a panel conversation on how diversity and inclusion drive innovation. This event is open to everyone, and we've already had over 1,500 registered attendees. It's clear that this topic is one that the intelligence community continues to wrestle with. And finally, on Friday, we close out at 4:30 p.m. with our blockbuster Sisterhood of Spies panel. So with that, today's program is adjourned. Stay safe and healthy. We look forward to welcoming you back tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Have a great day.